board, well, besides she was the longest serving member, current member of the board of the Humanities Center. But Erica was my student. Sorry. So I've known her for 30 years. It's a very, actually the second student that when you realize you've starting to outlive your students, it's kind of very difficult, especially when you're outliving your favorite students. So Erica was my student. She was an extraordinary person. She had a fairly hard life. Before she was a law student, she was a single mom. She was a single mom when she was going to law school. She had been the only woman working in a nuclear power plant. Something about her strength, her integrity. She was the compliance officer, so she wasn't the most popular person in that plant either. And this came up when we had a little, I don't know how to describe it, meeting. Her children were there, reminiscing about her. And I said that I always had the sense that nothing was difficult for Erica, because when she faced some difficulty, she said to herself, this is not as hard as the nuclear power plant. Erica had sitting on her desk, and it now sits on my desk, one of those little Zen gardens, with the sand and the stones. I have it sitting on my desk. That's not that I needed to remember her, but it always symbolizes her to me, because she was quiet. There was such strength underneath there, such intelligence. I don't think most of my colleagues actually understood exactly how smart she was. But I did, because I taught her, so. And she was not the kind, she was humble in that sense. She had a true humility, I think. But she was fierce and angry when she saw injustice. And that was something that, knowing her as long as I did, I knew was always there. But other people only saw it in those kinds of situations. So it's a terrific loss for me personally, for us in the law faculty and for the Humanities Center. I'll close with this thought. I'm in the process of writing a little memorial for her for the law review, which I found very difficult for the reasons that you can probably see. One of her favorite movies was Babette's Feast. I don't know if you know the story. It's based on a short story by Isaac Emerson. Babette was one of the communards, right? And went to the barricades in 1848 in Paris and were suppressed by the army. So that's where the term communism comes from, in fact, communism. In the story, she is the poor housekeeper of these two elderly women who run a very ascetic sect, Christian sect in Denmark. Babette, the housekeeper, wins the lottery, and she takes all of her earnings and she spends it on the most fabulous dinner for the congregation. They're all ascetics, so they all agree not to enjoy it. And she cooks this extraordinary dinner of turtle soup. She has a live turtle. If you haven't seen the movie, he has the resistance as a quail with foie gras in a puff pastry. And there's one guest who's the nephew of one of the congregants who is a general in the army and had been stationed in Paris. He had also once been one of the suitors of one of the elderly sisters. And he says, this is the signature dish of the Café d'Artiste in Paris. And I've never seen it before anywhere else but there. And of course, at the end of the movie, Babette says to the sisters, I was the chef at the Café d'Artiste. And they're a little stunned, and they say, well, I would guess you're going back to Paris now that you're rich. You've won 10,000 francs. And she said, no, I spent all of that on the dinner. Right? And she said, dinner for 12 at the Café d'Artiste cost 10,000 francs. And they said, but now you're poor. And she said, an artist is never poor.
I'm wondering if you would accommodate the Humanities Center by standing for 1 minute as to honor a former member of the American board who served us very well for many
social and political science.
This is a hearty bunch to be here. I want to first echo my colleague Steve Winter's appreciation of Erica B. Tremonas. I didn't know her anywhere near as well as Stephen did. But she really was an important force within the law school and within the campus, and someone who helped to bridge what's often a seeming chasm between the professional school on the one hand and the humanities on the other. And so she's greatly missed as a colleague. Well, I am speaking here today, broadly speaking, about what might be called the deplatforming controversies. That is to say, this spate of conflicts that have occurred on university campuses and some other places in the course of the last few years that have to do with the question of who should be allowed by the audience to speak, who should be shouted down, if anyone, who should be disrupted, whether indeed there is something fundamentally wrong and fundamentally uncivil with actions being taken by people in the community who want to say about people who they view as purveyors of hate speech that we are not having this conversation, that this speech is not welcome here, this is not who we are as a community, and we're not prepared to tolerate that. And so the title of the talk is Tolerating Purveyors of Hate Speech, Civility or Complicity. I'll start with a little quotation from Herbert Marcuse, who in the 1960s wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance. And he said, when tolerance mainly serves the protection and preservation of a repressive society, when it serves to neutralize opposition and render men immune against other and better forms of life, then tolerance has been perverted. When the false consciousness has become prevalent, the national and popular behavior, it translates itself almost immediately into practice. The safe distance between ideology and reality, repressive thought and repressive action, between the word of destruction and the deed of destruction is dangerously shortened. And so this is really something, a concept that frames the issue here. And what I really want to do in this talk is to really address what has become this extraordinarily vituperative confrontation between what might be called the left center and the center left over this question about freedom of expression versus suppression of hate speech. It is, I think, at a moment when we face an extraordinary challenge, the likes of which have already been described obliquely and otherwise in the course of the day from the particular administration that we have in Washington and from other political authorities. It's very vexing to see this kind of vituperative clash among people who should all be on the same side in the face of this. So I would like to shed some light on the issue about deplatforming or suppression of what is purported to be hate speech, really as a way of trying to convert this from an issue into a problem. That is to say, to see this not as an illustration of a deeper divide and something that exposes the deep sort of moral rot of the other side of the debate, but rather as a problem that we face, being people generally of a progressive orientation who are looking to grapple with a problem in a serious way. And what I want to do is, first of all, to rebut what I regard as the trivialization and oversimplification of the grievances of those who are engaged in such protests, and to try to make what I consider to be the soundest arguments on behalf of those who are dedicated to the proposition that certain things must not be allowed to be said here. And on the other side, to try to expose the real perils, ethical and political, of these kinds of exercises of power from below. I don't have a bumper sticker solution to this question. I do think that both sides have been saying things about these issues that are fundamentally wrong and can be exposed as being wrong. and that the real issues, the real problems have to be developed in a more serious way, and one that is more generous on the part of both the center-left and the left-center toward each other with respect to this question. So the first thing, we've had a conference about civility today. I haven't heard anyone try to define civility. And one of the difficulties with definitions of civility is that very frequently people read other sort of moral principles into the idea of civility that lends civility a certain kind of substance that skews the discourse. Many things are uncivil, but what's wrong with them is something other than their being uncivil. So slander is uncivil, but it's wrong because it's slander, not because it's uncivil. So the real question is how one thinks about what incivility is. And I also want to think about civility in terms of civil society, in terms of the political significance of the moment in which civility is or is not deployed, because it's not simply a matter of personal virtue. And indeed, one of the difficulties of tolerance as a concept, and tolerance of different points of view, is that it tends to reduce the question to a personal question about virtue and your willingness to be a kind of open person who's willing to engage with other people and respect them as human beings. And that's fine, but in the political context, you have responsibilities as an actor not merely to the people upon whom you're acting, but also to the people on whose behalf you purport to be acting. When you step into a political role, you have other kinds of responsibilities, and sometimes being civil to someone actually sends a kind of destructive political message. So the question is, what is civility? I think for these purposes, civility means treating your interlocutor as someone who belongs as part of this conversation. And the fact is that some people don't belong in the conversation. And acquiescing in their presence in the conversation actually has all manner of secondary effects with respect to people often who are not in the room, who are the objects of the conversation, and people whose perspectives are going to be foreclosed in a conversation where a particular participant in the conversation is going to be able to establish as legitimate a particular framework of the discussion. And so the difficulty here is that you have people who are looking to open certain kinds of questions that ought to be closed. And this is what creates the kind of clash with the free speech sensibility, which wants to say that all questions ought to be open questions. The problem is that when the question that you're opening is the question of equal concern and respect for all members of the community, when what you're opening is the question of whether certain parts of the community that have been historically subordinated and excluded and disparaged and marginalized actually belong there, you are, in opening that question, in some sense, being complicit in the undermining of the status of those persons. And this is not because it hurts people's feelings. And I actually think that both sides are, in some ways, guilty in this discourse of fixating on this idea that certain speech is hurtful because it bothers people, because it makes people feel unwelcome, and so on. These are problems in the real world, and sometimes they actually have real concrete effects on people, but for reasons I'll discuss later, I don't think they can be the criteria for making determinations about what sort of speech we can accept. But the real problem is not what sort of effects it has on people's psyches when they're confronted with disparagements. The problem is that this, in a very real way, poisons the well. That by normalizing a certain kind of discourse about people who have already been historically marked out for subordination and marginalization and exclusion, one is, in fact, making life in the society more dangerous for those people, making those people more likely to confront violence, making those people more likely to confront discrimination, making those people more likely to confront harassment and other kinds of perhaps subtle forms of displacement from society's public spaces in important ways. So to make it sound as though this is a problem about snowflakes, This is one of the most irritating things, I have to say, that I have ever heard in academic discourse. And I blame Jonathan Haidt for this, and more about him later for anyone who wants to hear me rant. But the idea that the problem here is that we have to, people are hypersensitive, they have hurt feelings, they need to be protected because they've been coddled all their lives before they came to college. This could not be more irrelevant to the actual issue here. The issue here has to do with the way in which society does or does not incorporate on an equal basis with equal standing certain parts of the community that have heretofore been treated very badly. And so I think it's very important to recognize what the actual stakes of this are. And to point out, too, that questions about civility and incivility are questions about, ultimately, the stakes of conflict. That, in fact, to attack people for being uncivil is, in many cases, to be disparaging the very stakes of the conflict that they experience. And I can give several examples about how people have reacted in that way. I think I may skip that, other than to say there was a particular episode that I was involved with on this very stage some years ago involving a group at the University of California in Irvine. Some of you might be familiar with the Irvine 11, who disrupted a speech of the Israeli ambassador in the wake of the Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip. A conflict that took the lives of 13 Israelis and 1,300 Palestinians, as you might recall. This was the Irvine 11 did not seek to prevent Oren from speaking. They disrupted in a rather moderate way to demonstrate the fact that this was not normal, that we could not normalize Oren, whose main role at that point was as apologist for Operation Cast Lead. And he was not only there to give a talk, he was there to receive an honor from the university. He was an honored guest of the university. And from a particular perspective, what he was an apologist for criminality. Now, maybe he was and maybe it wasn't. The question of the criminality of Operation Cast Lead is a live question, and I'm not seeking to prejudice that discussion. But the real problem is the disparagement of the Irvine 11, who ended up facing criminal charges, believe it or not, for conspiracy to commit a misdemeanor, if you can believe it, for having engaged in this moderate form of disruption that allowed Oren actually to speak, but which sought effectively to withdraw from below what they saw as an honor wrongfully conferred from above. And it seemed to me that whatever one thinks about whether this was a good idea or the pros and cons of the underlying question, the disparagement of these young people who were really quite courageous and paid a big price really was quite out of line. In fact, was uncivil. And so these questions kind of collapse in on themselves. I say all of this in some respect to highlight the fact that if you want to be a real advocate for civility, and under most circumstances I am, you have to recognize the limits of civility. Just as if you want to be taken seriously as an advocate for peace, you have to renounce pacifism. Because you're not going to convince anybody. Pacifists are fine, but pacifists are inert politically because they cannot convince people for whom the question of war or peace is one that is sensitive to actual circumstances. And so you need to actually, to have credibility on the question of civility and its desirability, you need to understand something about the limits. Another thing I want to focus on here, and I'm not going to get all the way through the things I want to say in the amount of time that I have, but I want to talk a little bit about freedom of speech and its relationship to the First Amendment, because this is another area where people have a tendency to oversimplify mightily. First of all, freedom of speech and the First Amendment are not one and the same thing. Free speech principles transcend the question of the First Amendment. The First Amendment pertains to governmental action. Free speech is a much broader proposition and deals with the responsibilities, the ethical responsibilities that we have as citizens to one another, as well as governmental action. But also, free speech is not reducible to what the Supreme Court, in its contemporary jurisdiction, contemporary jurisprudence, has determined count as the rules of First Amendment law. So again, another haughty thing that gets said about the demonstrators is these people just don't understand free speech. They don't understand it's right there. That hate speech is protected. It's right there in the Constitution. No, the Constitution literally says something you cannot possibly mean, which is that Congress can make no law abridging freedom of speech. So therefore, it can't make consumer fraud laws, presumably. There are lots and lots of crimes you can commit just by speaking. That's not what freedom of speech means in that context. And so freedom of speech has meant many different things, actually, since 1791. And only recently, only in the last 2 generations, has it come to mean what it's understood as meaning now. And the most fundamental thing it's understood as meaning now is something called viewpoint neutrality. There's no such thing as free speech absolutism, but there is such a thing as viewpoint neutrality. And viewpoint neutrality works in a very odd way. It operates from the premise that, constitutionally speaking, there's no such thing as a false idea. It's not because people who say this think that there's no such thing as a false idea. They're saying that from the standpoint of governmental regulation of speech, we cannot have the government take sides with respect to a battle of ideas. What's weird about that is the most important case decided on this about 25 years ago was R.A.V. versus St. Paul about cross-burning. And the idea here was that even if the speech is otherwise regulable, you can't discriminate against hate speech and allow other kinds of speech to go unimpeded in the same category. That you actually can't discriminate against racists who might use cross-burning as a way of expressing themselves without equally having a kind of viewpoint neutral regulation with respect to any other way that people might offensively express themselves in ways that would amount to what's called fighting words, which I won't get into. So there's it's a very rigid rule about viewpoint neutrality with respect to this matter. This didn't come from 1791. It was not the rule in 1952 when the Supreme Court of the United States in Beauharnais versus Illinois upheld the idea of group libel, which is to say hate speech against particular groups. And that was considered to be within the scope of constitutional regulation at that time. That being said, Beauharnais versus Illinois was part of a long line of cases in First Amendment law that are just awful. And so if you want to go back to Beauharnais versus Illinois, you may be buying back into a series of constitutional decisions that were permissive of a tremendous amount of speech regulation, going all the way back to the Supreme Court upholding the 1918 Sedition Act, which is, if I were to read to you the statute, you would be just astonished that such a statute would actually be passed in the United States, let alone held. So what I want to point out then is that there's a real difference between the essence of freedom of speech, which is understood very differently in foreign democracies like Canada, and understood very differently in international human rights law than it is by the Supreme Court of the United States. And so the idea that the essence of free speech is inherently this idea of viewpoint neutrality is not a broadly shared liberal democratic principle, it's just the one we've got. As a matter of First Amendment law. I think there are justifications for viewpoint neutrality as a constraint on how government regulates speech. But the idea that the spirit of the First Amendment represents this constraint on how we think about freedom of speech and incorporates viewpoint neutrality, I think is quite problematic. Many other things to be said, but just to wrap up, let me say that there are very real perils to the kinds of deplatforming campaigns and so forth that have been carried out. One thing that we really have not seen from those who favor these kinds of actions is a set of serious criteria about what does and does not count as hate speech. Hate speech has been judicially defined in certain jurisdictions. It could be defined. But if you end up with this situation in which if you crack down on one thing and people are unwilling to crack down on that thing, you have to crack down on the people who are unwilling to crack down on it, and then you have to crack down on the people who are unwilling to crack down on that. And so the problem now, under this reductio ad absurdum, is in this last week of William and Mary, the director of the ACLU was shouted down because the ACLU was defending the rights of people that they didn't want to have speak to speak, and therefore the ACLU shouldn't get to speak speak either. This is a really big problem. And I think that what we have to do is particularly avoid a collapse into a discussion about sensibilities where we're necessarily going to try to tie the suppression of speech to people's subjective reactions, which will necessarily lead to vagueness and overbreadth, two concepts I could go into at great length, but that necessarily make a mess out of not only any legal framework, but any ethical framework for dealing with people's expression. So with that, I bid you thanks.
For questions?
So I don't know if I agree with the definition, but I don't think that will take a lot of going back and forth. But there are various institutions in society that have different kinds of functions. There's the justice system, there's legislatures, there's universities. And so I think universities is having, one of its main functions is trying to figure out or pursue the truth. And those kinds of aims aren't easily overridden by consequentialist considerations, I think. And so I think that's what speaks strongly for, strongly against incivility in academic institutions. There's a way to let people speak, and of course, if they're saying hate speech, there ought to be an opportunity somewhere in a panel or something for somebody else to counter it. But that's one thing, and to be uncivil in the context seems to be something else that would require quite a bit of consequentialist support to justify it. Maybe it'd be fine if was it Irvine, wasn't it? The case, you know, outside the lecture hall for people to protest and the like. But I think there should be this open space left for anybody to say anything as long as it doesn't incite a riot or something like that. And then I want them to come on top. I want the Nazis to come here, and I want to be able to respond.
Well, and I could throw that back. Why do you want the Nazis to come here?
Because I want people to hear what's wrong with their view. This is an institution aimed at the truth, and there's some truth to this matter.
Well, there is some truth to this matter, but the question is, you know, do we want to reopen the question? And you know, we've known each other a long time. We've been batting these balls back and forth for a long time. You're sort of a professional debater, and that's all well and good. But the difficulty is that you're really making the stakes of that discourse that take place at any given moment, perhaps in the hands of someone not as evil as you. That where you can lose an argument to a Holocaust denier if you don't come armed with all of the talking points, if you haven't seen behind and anticipated every talking point that this person is going to have. You are going to potentially lend credibility to ideas that make no contribution to truth because they have been so systematically refuted, and the opening the door to them is so pernicious in terms of undermining an understanding in the society that really represents, I think, what we have to borrow from the odious Wilmore Kendall, who I was otherwise going to talk about today. But he spoke about public truth, which is a standard that society has a right to defend. And I think that basically any pursuit of truth and any other activity in society is predicated ultimately on a certain set of principles that Nazism cannot be part of. Nazism cannot be part of the accommodation that we have with our fellow citizens about how we're going to manage disagreement, because there's some disagreement that's beyond the scope of that accommodation.
I just want to say I'm a mediocre debater, and there are a lot more people right here, and there better be in the university who are very good debaters.
Is lying considered a form of speech?
Well, lying, you can of course think about things in different ways, but lying, of course, is a form of actionable speech as a matter of ordinary law. You can be, in fact, sued for libel. You can be prosecuted for fraud. There are all sorts of ways, and obviously you can commit perjury. So there are all of these things that, of course, are speech, but they're regulable speech in particular circumstances. And of course, if you lie to your friend about whatever, then you're not engaged in a legally significant act. But lying is as much a form of speech as anything else, I would say.
I guess the reason why I just threw it out there like that, because I understood it before I said it in terms of some of the reasons that you gave. But I guess the question is now is because we're getting unhealthy doses of lying on a very large scale. And the fact that it's being normalized, does that suggest that there are some major breakdowns in societal norms? And if not breakdowns, huge fissures somewhere?
Yeah. I think it's really extraordinary what's happening, and the idea of fake news is something that I personally hadn't heard of. I mean, I remember the National Enquirer when I was young, but I've never seen anything like this, and particularly kind of coordinated campaigns to get people to believe things that aren't true, that are relevant to public policy. And that does create all sorts of difficult problems because on the one hand, who do you trust to regulate what is and is not fake news? And the practical problems about governmental regulation go to really nitty-gritty questions like that. And on the other hand, the idea that a free marketplace of ideas is going to bring us out of this problem, neglects the fact that a market, in fact, requires regulation when there are market failures, and this is a form of market failure.
Thank you.
Isn't this sort of a way, in a way we say, the society is sort of saying to itself, how do we correct socially a bad idea if we don't know what it is? That if people don't speak their mind, no matter how crazy, we can't sort of correct them. Is that, in a sense, is that society what we're sort of struggling with here, that knowledge of what is wrong can have a corrective effect?
Yeah, it might, and it might have other kinds of effects too. I mean, John Stuart Mill famously took the position that if we don't confront the things that are wrong, we'll forget why we're right. That we need to actually, we need these arguments to hone our own better arguments. But I think the difficulty is a lot of times it's not that we don't know what these arguments are, and if we normalize them, if we provide them a place that gives them a certain kind of respect and dignity, we might find ourselves creating spaces in the society where this can incubate. And it doesn't require that they win an election. It doesn't require that they have an enormous critical mass in order to work harm. Rather small groups of people can work a tremendous amount of harm. And so, but